Today we settle into the cozy nostalgia of America's pastime, the crack of a bat, the cheer of a crowd, long summer nights, hot dogs and a cold beer in hand. Amidst the backdrop of a White Sox game in the vibrant year of 1919, the air was thick with anticipation. But this time, it wasn't just the game that had spectators on the edge of their seats. Imagine, if you will, a grand spectacle in the skies, the iconic blimp, a symbol of grace and marvel, hovering above the baseball diamond. The stage was set for a harmonious fusion of two great American traditions, yet destiny had its own script to write. In a twist that caught everyone off guard, a scheduled firework display was absent from the agenda. Little did the crowd know they were about to witness an unforeseen burst of drama, an event that would etch itself in the annals of aviation history. So grab your helium and join us as we unravel the mystery and intrigue of that fateful day in 1919 when the blimp, instead of gracefully navigating the skies, took an unexpected nosedive into the heart of the baseball spectacle. The winds of fate, the cheers of the crowd, and the roar of the engines all blended into a story that transcends time. Get ready to soar through the clouds of nostalgia as we unravel the secrets of the blimp that crashed into the White Sox. This is Destination-Aviation. Well, welcome back to the podcast, fellow aviation enthusiasts. Appreciate you being here. We're actually trying out some new technology, so hopefully to help with some of the sound. It's called Troy Studios. It's a little box that reduces some of the background noises. I don't think we really have had much in our podcast, but it's definitely a helpful tool to help us on our quest for excellence. But I hope everybody is doing well. We're gearing up here for the holiday season, which is rapidly approaching us, probably going to be as busy as we saw on Thanksgiving. And actually, in part of that news, as we like to talk about a little bit up front here, the airlines are set to be about a 2.7% net profit across the whole spectrum. So that varies a little bit airline to airline, but 2.7% in profit. So next time you're paying for your extra legroom or your baggage, whatever it might be, just know that they're making profit off of it. So, I guess they finally found a business model that works for them. So good for that. A lot of my friends that fly, they are finally getting their just dues with payments. Happy for everybody there. Not maybe as happy when I see the ticket price, but hey, it is what it is. I'm actually planning on a trip to Aruba, and our ticket prices came back relatively well. They were, I'm not a huge fan of flying on Spirit. I'm not, in case something goes wrong. It doesn't seem like they have the fleet to get you to where you need to go, but the connection out of O'Hare seemed like it was the best. It's actually through Fort Lauderdale. There was a direct flight in United. I would have taken that if they still offered it in February, but they don't. So Spirit to Fort Lauderdale to Aruba, but we have about an hour and 45-minute connection, so looking good there. But $280 round trip with a bag, so it can't complain with that type of price structure. So looking forward to that. Another thing that's happening for maybe some of our tour folks out there is the National Park Service has proposed to do FAA-backed regulations that basically kind of threaten air tour operations. Things like Mount Rushmore, it's half a mile and 5,000 feet or above. I don't know if anybody's actually ever been to Mount Rushmore. I went out there when I turned 18 years old. Probably kind of a dorky thing, right? Where am I going to go when I turn 18? Let's go to Mount Rushmore. That sounds like a lot of fun. I don't know what I was thinking, but it seemed like the perfect spot to go when you turn 18. South Dakota, middle of nowhere. It's interesting, though, because you always see it from the perspective of like a postcard, or you see it, in the movies, and it looks so grandiose and big. And then when you're there in person, you have to basically, not that you need, those little, I forget, the magnifiers, sightseeing little poles that they put out. But they're, just so you know, for reference, if you haven't been there, they are there because that is a distance where it's kind of required. I guess back in the day, there was a trail you could walk up and actually go up to the base of it. But, a lot of the rocks, when they chiseled it away, are down there. And I guess some people got hurt. And naturally, as things go in life. People that got hurt sued, and so they shut down part of the trail. So now you have to stand in the background. If you're going in on an air tour, you're going to be at 5,000 feet and a half mile away. Better bring your binoculars to take a look at it. It's interesting. We talked about it in one of the episodes when I was up in Voyager National Park, the restricted area for operators. And I understand, I get the part of it of pristine. You're out in the woods. You want to enjoy it. So I don't know. It seems to me like in a case like Mount Rushmore, it's not pristine. I mean, you're there looking at it and people are yelling and screaming and eating hot dogs next to you, buying buttons in the gift shop. So it doesn't really have this aura of serene quietness. Maybe they could find some balance between a place like Mount Rushmore and maybe like, I don't know, Arches National Park, where you're trying to really immerse yourself into nature and get away from, the stresses of the world. So we'll see. Right now it's in place to be a proposed rule for our fellow aircraft operators and their sightseeing tours. And this is a sad story. A YouTuber died in a plane crash. This is reported out by the Knoxville News Sentinel. I had not seen Jenny Blalock. She was 45 years old. She was an aviation vlogger, basically in and out of Tennessee. She had 16,000 subscribers on YouTube. She shared her aviation stories, obviously much like what we're doing here, or what we've talked about doing when we maybe start filming in the plane. So her FlightAware data shows the aircraft was registered to Plantation Reclaimed Inc. It took off from Island Home Airport in Knoxville at 10:48 a.m. There was en route for more than an hour before crashing in Giles County. A local news outlet also reported Blalock's father, James Blalock Jr., 78, died in the accident, according to Bill Myers, Director of Emergency Services for the Giles County. Myers said that the plane crashed into a hillside in a remote area of the county, making it difficult for them to reach the accident site. NTSB is investigating, and it was noted it ultimately flying from Madison, Minnesota to Benton, Arkansas. And a comment in her last Instagram post, Blalock had said that the aircraft was undergoing avionics work in Arkansas. Very sad to hear. Obviously, not going to speculate on what's going on. There's plenty of comments out there. Rest in peace with Shelley, and we'll keep track of it if further comes out on this accident. But horrible to see. Her last video though is up to 1.6 million views now. So considering that she tried to share her life with all of us, at least people are taking notice. So, sad to see that though. Everybody in this industry knows I advocate for safety, and, unfortunately sometimes, it's a dangerous activity, and no matter how many precautions one may take, there's always that chance. So for some reason, we always seem to end up on Russia sometimes in these podcasts. Maybe it's because a lot of strange stuff comes out of Russia, but this was interesting. Cabin crew recall strange behavior of a Russian passenger who snuck on board a Los Angeles-bound flight without documentation. Obviously, flying is one of the most secure ways to travel, so it's just amazing to me that somebody could actually get onto an airplane without any documentation. But Sergey, that's what he did here. He got onto the aircraft. He landed in Los Angeles. When he went to talk to Customs and Border Patrol, he claimed he left his passport on the plane, and then later on claimed that he doesn't even remember how he got on the airplane. And so they're investigating exactly what has happened here. So it was later revealed that he had identification from Israel and Russia, but could not explain how he got on the aircraft. So the FBI charged him with basically being a stowaway, even though he had a seat. The crew on board the aircraft said that he exhibited strange behavior during the flight. He repeatedly changed seats and walked around the aircraft aimlessly. He attempted to eat the cabin's crew chocolate. So that's interesting. The other major, the most interesting thing about this is who the heck is flying these days where there's multiple open seats? Because I'd like to be on that airplane. Just one last noting, this is a Scandinavian aircraft, so Scandinavian Airlines. And, I don't know, back and forth, people are blaming the cabin crew. They did take a head count check, but supposedly that was just for weight and balance. So he is in jail. Hopefully they'll give him some chocolates there. And then when he gets out, he can tell us how he attempted to move around multiple seats on an airliner these days. What's new in Washington? Well, we still have a gridlock. That's what's new. Yeah, there's not much. The Congress, I don't know, Senate floated some stuff about extending the FAA into March. So far, we are still in limbo as it comes. So we are good through December 31st. January 1st, you might have some angry TSA workers and some angry air traffic controllers. So be mindful of that if you're traveling and we end up not paying them, at least in the moment. They will always end up getting paid down the road. It's just we're kicking that can of continuing resolution. And we do want to end here, I think, on the news in a positive note. A small twin-engine aircraft, 1980 Piper PA-23-250, for those that want to be specific. It landed in Dallas on Highway 80 in Kaufman County. Don't know what happened here, obviously. Registration is November 6 Romeo Charlie. Landed on the highway, backed up the traffic, but plane's a little dented up, smashed up, if you get out and see it in the news reports. But both the occupants walked away healthy and on their own two legs. So, always good to throw in a positive story here about maybe a mishap that, unfortunately damaged an aircraft. Nobody ever wants that, but you're walking away from it. So that's always a good thing. So as we started talking about today's podcast episode, it occurred to me that we have never done anything on a blimp or a rigid airship, if you will. I've always thought that it would be so cool to travel that way if you could build out some sort of I don't know, like a classy type of almost estate cabins with, like a fancy bar. I think, people obviously, if you're traveling for business or you're traveling for pleasure and you just want to get somewhere, maybe not. But if you want to travel in the old fashioned days and really kind of like a cruise, the traveling is part of the trip. I think it would be the bee's knees, as the kids in 1919 would say, about traveling in a rigid airship. They just look so cool. I actually lived out in California for a while. I think I've mentioned that in some of these episodes. And I had traveled back and forth between the Bay Area and San Joaquin Valley. So over by Stockton, California. If anybody's driven that route, it's horrible and horrendous with traffic. But it always took you by, at least, generally speaking, I would go by the Livermore Airport, depending on how I was snaking back across from the Bay Area. And you'd go by the Livermore Airport. And one of the things that I saw one day was they'd be like the world's smallest blimp, and it was advertising vodka. And the guy was coming over the road and maneuvering it, and it just looked to me like, I think it just kind of said vodka on the side of it. It's just, the whole thing was hilarious looking. Don't know whatever happened to that airship. Maybe he was drinking vodka from the way he was maneuvering over the road. Hard to say. And it's interesting. I've actually known some people that have worked at the Livermore Airport. Seems like a difficult airport to work at. Just there's a lot of noise complaints. Obviously, right? People move by an airport and then all of a sudden they want the airport to close. I just saw some advertising that in 24 months they want the the leaded fuel phased out of the airport. So that's going to be difficult. Obviously everybody's going towards unleaded fuel, but at this stage, there's just not a good alternative. So to put a time frame that aggressive on it is going to be difficult for the operators there. But back to our story is the rigid airship or the blimp. And a couple of things as I was looking into this. Obviously I've mentioned this before. I'm in the Chicago region. This accident actually took place in Chicago in 1919. It involved a blimp. It involved the White Sox. Interesting enough, I was on an airplane once flying back to Chicago from Texas, and there's a couple kids sitting in front of me, and they were the first time coming to Chicago, and one of them said, "Oh, we're going to have to go to Wrigley Field, and it's going to be so much fun, Soldier Field." And the other person flying with them said, "Well, don't they have another baseball team in Chicago?" And he was like, I don't know, the Red Sox? He's like, no, that doesn't sound right. And so I sat back there laughing because obviously I haven't lived in Chicago my whole life. I'm still fairly new to the area. I've been here a couple of years now, but I grew up near-ish Chicago. And, you know, the Cubs fans out there are kind of diehards. When I lived in Pittsburgh, to me, it's kind of the same with the Steelers. You get these teams that are iconic, and no matter where you go, people are championing their team. The White Sox, not so much had the following, but there are some really diehard White Sox fans in Chicago, including somebody that I know. And so when I got back, of course, I had to tell them the story that nobody knew exactly who his team was on this on this airplane. So it made me laugh. I still have my Michael Jordan White Sox baseball card. So maybe someday that's going to be huge amounts of cash. If this podcast doesn't take off, I always have that Michael Jordan White Sox card to get me through the bad times. So the blimp in particular we're talking about in this episode is Wingfoot Express, and this was actually owned by Goodyear. I thought it would be valuable to talk a little bit about Goodyear and the blimp. Obviously, for me, it was always perplexing. I've actually seen this blimp up close and personal in my life, but kind of that thought of, okay, we're a tire company. You know what we should do? We should get a blimp. Let's get a blimp. And that's when people look up in the sky, they'll say, God, I wish I had 4 new radials. Oh, wait, look, there's a blimp. And of course, the jokes that go along with it. I remember, if anybody is a Naked Gun fan, Leslie Nielsen, and he talks about his wife dying in a tragic blimp accident. She says, Goodyear. And he goes, no, it was the worst. Or I believe it was in that 70s show with Kelso. And it was Leo, and he's like, "Oh yeah, no man, I saw a flying saucer once, and it even spoke to me. It said Goodyear." So yeah, that was my impersonation of Leo the hippie from the 70s show, and also referencing back to our Mr. Goodyear blimp here. Fun fact: there are less blimp pilots than there are astronauts. It's not something that one usually goes into, that there's a plentiful amount of jobs. But I hear that there's some things happening out there with potential new blimp development. So maybe we'll talk a little bit about that at the end of the podcast here. For now, we're going to go into a little bit of the history. So the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company was founded in 1898. America was feeling the full effects of the Industrial Revolution, capitalizing on the momentum and looking for unique ways to expand beyond tires. Goodyear entered into the business of lighter-than-air balloons and aircraft that eventually led to the creation of America's most enduring corporate icons, the Goodyear blimp. Now, we talk about the Wingfoot. This is where that name comes from. So blimp history says is pre-1920s. Wingfoot Lake. The Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company's Wingfoot Lake Airship Base, located near Akron, Ohio, and sometimes called the Kitty Hawk of lighter than air, is the oldest airship base in the United States. Side note here, if any Seinfeld fans out there, if you remember when George is scarfing down the shrimp, he goes to Akron, Ohio to zing a guy who went to go work for Goodyear Blimp. And if you remember right, his pitch was, a Goodyear day at Yankee Stadium. And they're like, you just want us to throw the tires on the infield? So I digress. I know I'm all full of 80s and 90s references, but I'm sure somebody out there is laughing, or if not, at least I am. Goodyear entered the fledgling aviation industry when it established its aeronautics department in 1910 to market rubber-infused fabrics and coatings for airplanes and lighter-than-air aircraft. Goodyear built its first balloon in 1912, and the next year began building and flying balloons in national and international competitions. I would assume that's the world's slowest race. In 1916, Goodyear bought 720 acres land southeast of Akron to serve as a flying field and manufacturing site. It included Fridges Lake, which provided water power for the Geist Mill and water reserve for factories several miles downstream. Construction of the Wingfoot Lake hangar started in March 1917. The facility and the lake itself were named after Goodyear's corporate emblem, the winged foot and Roman god Mercury. And now remember, our accident took place just 2 years later in 1919. Goodyear's first airship production began in March 1917 when the U.S. Navy ordered 9 B-type airships. Since the hangar at Wingfoot Lake was still under construction, The initial prototype, the B-1, was erected in a large amusement park building in Chicago. The B-1 first flew March 24th, 1917. 5 days later, it was flown nonstop to within a few miles of Wingfoot Lake. The second airship, the B-2, was also erected in Chicago and soon joined the B-1 as a training ship at Wingfoot Lake. In 1918, the Navy ordered 15 C-type airships from Goodyear, and production of the C-1 began at Wingfoot Lake, and shortly thereafter, after its competition, the C-1 was flown to the Navy facility in Rockaway, Long Island, New York, via Washington, D.C. on October 22nd. The next airship, the C-2, was used for training at Wingfoot Lake. Although most of the B and C ships built by Goodyear were shipped to the Navy for final assembly and flight testing, Wingfoot Lake was used as a training site for first-class Navy airship pilots. With Goodyear personnel as instructors, some 600 Army and Navy officers and enlisted men were trained to fly and maintain B and C-type airships, kite observation balloons, and free balloons. The Navy took over Wingfoot Lake facility and operated it as a U.S. Naval Airship Training Station from 1917 through 1921. It served as construction, test, and development base and consisted of 26 buildings, and by the end of World War I, this facility was full-fledged. The first commanding officer was Lieutenant Commander Louis Maxfield, and the last commanding officer was Lieutenant Commander Zachary Lansdowne. In June of 1919, Goodyear started operating its own airships, and its inaugural fleet included the Wingfoot Express and 3 Pony Blimps. The Roaring Twenties. During this period, Goodyear blimps began dotting the sky over America and brought Goodyear's name to remote locations across the country, from Hollywood to Ohio and to New York to Florida. The Goodyear blimps made their presence known. Feats from air duels and publicity stunts were hallmarks of the aircraft industry. Wing walkers and aerobatic stunts gave aviation all kinds of a reputation for excitement and romance, and Goodyear's blimps sometimes joined in these attention-getting antics. It wasn't all for fun and games, though. The blimps were destined for greater things. As always in the plan, their role in advertising and marketing for the growing company was quickly becoming a legend. Meanwhile, the blimps and more complex, lighter-than aircraft were being groomed as defense vehicles for the military. Interesting to note that the history here on the Goodyear's website does not list in this accident that we're going to talk about. They just kind of skipped right over that. There's a lot of history in the Goodyear blimp, so I will not go through all of it. Their website has a ton of information, and there's a couple other websites that I've looked at as well that have some really great information on it, so I would recommend if you have interest in it, just go and take a look. Every decade, they did a lot. Obviously, the Goodyear blimps that we know today, I'll finish this out with where they stand now. They obviously are not building blimps like they used to for commercial service for the military. In May of 2011, Goodyear announced it was replacing its fleet of non-rigid airships with 3 semi-rigid airships. These obviously, the previous ones were in place for 50 years. Interesting enough, they're still carrying the same namesake. So there's Wingfoot 1, which is based in Pompano Beach Air Park, Wingfoot 2, which is based in Carson, California, and Wingfoot 3, which is based in Suffield, Ohio. The new airships are 246 feet long, and they are 52 feet longer than the old model of the GZ-20. The Zeppelin NT model is also slimmer and has a top speed of about 70 miles per hour and has a passenger galanda and seats that for up to 7 individuals. So that would be a pretty cool ride. The gondola also serves as a restroom. Both craft are outfitted with LED sign technology Goodyear calls Eagle Vision. This allows the aircraft to display bright, multicolored animated words and images. When I worked in Daytona, I've seen the Goodyear blimp, but DirecTV at the time also had a blimp with a little lights on it. I would assume now with the way cable is, they probably don't have a balloon, let alone a blimp. And I mean a child's balloon that you would get in the store. But we all paid those high prices for cable television for all those years, so I don't feel completely bad for them. So a couple things that have been learning scenarios for me here is that Goodyear was actually in the blimp industry. I just always assumed they used it as a advertising scheme rather than they actually built airships. So that's one. And then also, too, that they built airships right here in Chicago. I know one of the airports that I am at frequently, they actually have old airship anchors into the ground. You can't really see them anymore, but they are there, and there's some old photos around of blimps that were tied up. So that was very interesting to me, and it actually leads to the Wingfoot accident, which was here in Chicago, built in Chicago. And what we talked about, 1917, this blimp was really in service for 2 years. So if you can imagine, a brand new, potentially state of the art aircraft that has a huge accident within 2 years. Surprisingly, that has kind of just been hidden into aviation history and never talked about. I haven't seen anything on this accident until I started researching it. And like I said, you go to the Goodyear website and it's not on there. So I guess everybody kind of assumes it never happened. But except for here on Destination-Aviation podcast, because we were able to pull up the details. So let's get a little bit into this accident. On July 21st of 1919, the Wingfoot Air Express, it was launched from Grant Park, headed towards the White City Amusement Park, located in Woodlawn neighborhood on the south side. There were 5 people on board, including a newspaper photographer. The photographer, E.H. Horton, reportedly asked the ship's pilot, Jack Botner, to divert from the original flight path so he could get some aerial shots of the Chicago Loop. Botner complied, even though the airship's navigation had never been tested over the city. The blimp flew around a standard altitude of 1,200 feet. I was actually just out the other night going down through Chicago, and I usually keep it at about 2,000 feet now, so a little bit higher than what this is. You stay out of the Class Bravo for O'Hare, their airspace, and now Midway actually owns some airspace over Lake Michigan. I think it's 2,300 feet up to the bottom shelf of the Class Bravo for O'Hare. So for us, it's, that 2,000 feet is right about the sweet mark. You can monitor Chicago TRACON, but you don't have to be talking with them. We actually went down and landed in Gary, but it's kind of cool to see, that generally speaking, looking at some of these pictures in here, the history of the Chicago landscape with this unfortunate accident, but, hearing some of what they were doing to navigate around the city is still some of the stuff we're doing today. At 4:55 p.m., the airship caught fire and exploded over the densely packed buildings of the loop. Botner and the chief mechanic, Harry Wacker, parachuted to safety, but another mechanic, Henry Weaver, died when his parachute caught fire. The publicity agent for the amusement park, Earl Davenport, was not able to exit the airship and was killed upon impact. E.H. Horton jumped from the airship, breaking both his legs and later dying at the hospital. And if you remember what we talked about, Mr. Horton was the reporter who had asked to divert from the original flight plan so he could get better shots of the city. The Wingfoot then collapsed into the sheets of fire, falling onto the glass roof of the Illinois Trust and Savings Bank at the northeast corner of LaSalle and Jackson, across the street from the Federal Reserve. It's just crazy to think about, right? Imagine something like this happening in today's age, even if it was any type of aircraft, let alone a huge, massive airship like this, and for it just to be completely lost in history is mind-boggling to me. The women who worked on the top floor were just packing up to leave for the day. 10 employees of the bank were killed. According to the New York Times report filed the day of the disaster, the Wingfoot airship was said to have been filled with hydrogen gas, which according to the article was apparently not thought at the time to be flammable, but is obviously highly flammable. In the New York Times report, some of the Wingfoot crew speculated that perhaps a small quantity of oxygen entered the gas mix when the airship was being charged, and oxygen was considered flammable. The cause of the Wingfoot disaster cannot be accurately determined. Theories have ranged from a spark from a rotor, that the aircraft material from overheating in the sun. So in all, there were 3 people on the airship killed, 2 passengers and 1 crew member. 2 survived on the ship. There were 10 ground fatalities and 27 ground injuries. So this blimp was on its maiden voyage, and as the lead up into this episode talked about with America's pastime, unfortunately the White Sox fans were up close and personal with this accident. It's usually a thrill to see a Goodyear blimp flying over a sporting event. For nearly 100 years, the iconic silver airship has been observed flying over the World Series, the Super Bowl, the Olympics, and many other athletic venues around the world, providing fans with unique views from high above the playing field. The Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company's original airship, the Wingfoot Air Express, could have become the first to pass over a baseball game when it made its maiden voyage on July 21st, 1919 in Chicago. Instead, tragedy struck when the blimp exploded in midair and crashed into a crowded downtown bank, killing 13 people in America's first civilian aviation disaster. That's right, the first American civilian aviation disaster. By the end of the week, however, the story had already disappeared from the news pages as Chicago's Red Summer erupted in a wave of death and destruction all across the city. Before all that, the week began with a buzz as thousands of citizens flocked to the city center on a warm Monday morning to witness the strange hydrogen-powered airship floating over their heads. The Wingfoot Express had spent all day marking its way across from Grant Park to the edge of Lake Michigan. Goodyear's goal is sending up the blimp over one of the nation's biggest cities was to promote what the company saw as a future of passenger air travel. 4 miles south of Comiskey Park, fans of the first-place Chicago White Sox, wow, first place. I'll have to tell that person that I know that the White Sox were first place at one point. They must not have had Michael Jordan on the team then. Must have been excited to see the Wingfoot Express as it began to make its way from downtown from the loop towards its final destination, the White City Amusement Park, a popular Southside entertainment center named after the 1893 World's Fair that had turned Chicago into a global entrepreneurial force. In 1903, a decade after the World's Fair, Wilbur and Orville Wright launched their first powered flight from Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. But aside from a handful of military pilots during World War I, few Americans had ever taken to the skies by 1919. After being assembled at the White City Aerodome over the preceding weeks, by the way, if you ever put a notice to Air Mission in, Aerodome always seems to mess up new people in the industry. It did me as well. I was like, Aerodome? What's that? Oh, it's an airport. Okay, got it. But obviously it's more inclusive, right? It could be this with hot air balloons, etc. Kind of a carryover term from 1919, but still used today. The Wingfoot Express had taken its first 2 flights earlier in the day on July 21st. Short excursions with only the pilot, Captain Jack Bontner, and a handful of mechanics, government officials, and reporters on board for each trip. The sight of the 150-foot-long blimp overhead caused onlookers to gather on the street across from the city. At the Grant Park airstrip, thousands gathered to catch a close-up view of the Wingfoot after each landing. One final takeoff was scheduled at 4:50 p.m. The airship was returning to its home base for the night. By that time, 14,000 baseball fans on the South Side had seen their share of excitement from the home team too. The White Sox rallied twice in the late innings of a doubleheader against top rivals from the American League, New York Yankees, who entered the day 5.5 games behind Chicago in the standings. The crowd was electric over the White Sox versus the Yankees and the sweep that they were doing on the Yankees. But all of that excitement changed when everyone in the Sox Park witnessed what was happening in the skies in front of them. The instant it caught fire, there was a scream from the fans. The game was stopped, and all the watchers saw the catastrophe that was unfolding in front of them. It seemed the entire thing burned up in about half a minute. After that, there wasn't much enjoyment felt over the ball game, and so most people left. A crowd of nearly 20,000 gathered near the bank to witness the aftermath and offer help to the victims. The tragedy seemed unexplainable. Author Gary Chris wrote, "No one could quite take in the reality of what happened. How had this experimental blimp, this enormous floating firebomb, been allowed to fly over one of the most densely populated square miles on Earth?" The Wingfoot Express disaster led to sweeping changes in air safety. Within hours, Alderman Anton Cermak, Chicago's future mayor, led an effort to pass the nation's first air traffic regulations, restricting flights over major populated centers. The Grant Park airstrip was closed, and Chicago began building a municipal airport, now known as Midway International Airport, just a few miles west of the White City Amusement Park. Interesting to note, there are many noise complaints at Midway. In this case, they had moved the airport outside of the city, and as everything in life, people moved around the airport, and then they didn't like the airport. Yes, I will get on my soapbox and say that every time. Just a few miles west of the White City Amusement Park, the Goodyear refined its blimps to use helium instead of the more flammable hydrogen and introduced Pilgrim, the first modern, non-rigid airship. In 1925, 12 years later, the hydrogen-powered Hindenburg exploded in New Jersey and brought back memories of the Wingfoot Express. Interesting enough, if they would have taken some lessons from Goodyear, maybe they could have avoided one of the most popular of these accidents and just talked about immensely. This one, as we talked about, was pretty much lost to history. So the White Sox lost their winning streak, and what we talked about before, why this was really lost, is there was actually race riots that happened in Chicago after an African-American teenager named Eugene Williams was stoned off a raft and drowned at the 29th Street beach. By the time the White Sox had returned to Chicago, a lot of the city had been destroyed through the rioting that had happened in that time period. So obviously a lot of horrible, horrible stuff happening in Chicago during around this time period. But as we talked about at the beginning of the episode, with the sweeping changes that happen in this industry and kind of airships taking a much larger backseat to traditional air travel that has taken off, there is news of a new generation of airships taking to the skies. This was an article written by CNN in 2023 that I had read. The smooth white underbelly of the airborne whale sails across the sky, casting a shadow across the forest below. Other than its enormous size, through this whale has very little to do with animal's namesake. It is an airship. A French aeronautics company, Flying Whales, hopes its hybrid electric helium lift vehicle will change the shape of sustainable transportation. The airship could help solve the problem of how to transport cargo when infrastructure is lacking or just doesn't exist at all. Flying Whales is developing a 200-meter-long airship that will be lifted by 14 cells filled with helium gas and then propelled through the air by a hybrid electric system powered by sustainable aviation fuel. Carrying at least 2 crew members, the airships will be able to transport 60 tons of cargo, around the same as 2 or 3 freight trucks. The Flying Whales are designed to carry heavy, bulky items such as blades for wind turbines, logs collected from steep mountainsides, or construction materials being delivered to remote, isolated locations. The company is also claiming that their airships could deliver food or aid after natural disasters when railways or roads might be inaccessible. Compared to helicopters, which are go-to transport for remote cargo deliveries, Flying Whales claims that its airships will produce less than 10% of the carbon emissions while operating. Plus, their new freight system leaves wilderness and countryside untouched, while still connecting small rural communities to the wide global supply chain. It's not the only startup on the scene right now for potential new airships. LTA Research, backed by Google co-founder Sergey Brin, they're exploring a low-impact transport solution. The key question in manufacturing of these lighter-than-air gas-filled balloons is hydrogen or helium. Hydrogen is cheap, renewable, and has far more lifting power than helium. However, it's highly flammable and has long been associated with the devastating air disaster ships like the Hindenburg, and it doesn't say in this article, but like, the Wingfoot Express that nobody ever seems to remember, but we remember here. So it's interesting. Most of my life, I have heard that helium is a precious resource and we are slowly running out of it. Most guest estimates taking it out maybe another 100 years until it's gone. It's been interesting to me, that, it's so precious when it comes to things like surgery and working within the medical field that we still fill up like balloons with it if we're running out of it. But just tonight, I bought a squirrel balloon. It was floating around, and hey, you know what? I guess we have extra helium for it. So these ships will be on helium. The price increased 250% between 2011 and 2016. So there is a 67 times more expensive ratio than hydrogen. But it's interesting. It's still, considered extremely safe comparative to hydrogen. There's some thoughts here about mixing gas, about, better sensors. So it'll be curious to see how these, continue to unfold. The FAA lists hydrogen as an unstable lifting gas. So to do anything on that front, they would have to get regulation to change. But, looking at some of these pictures online, it's really pretty awesome and cool looking. I hope that, they continue to advance the technology, and maybe all of us will get a chance to get on a airship here sooner than later. Well, it appears that from the clock, it is now past my bedtime for me to wrap this up. Say thank you to all you listeners out there for continuing to tune into the channel. Please subscribe to it. Feel free to drop me a line at dapodcast85@gmail.com. If you want to recommend anything, swear at me, whatever you so choose to do via email. It is the internet, so you never know what you're going to get. But until next time, my friends, I will see you down the runway.